Today I am reviewing a book, a set of rules called 1 Hour Wargames, and as the subtitle says, these are rules for practical tabletop battles for those with limited time and space. Here you will find rules for a large variety of engagements that cover very different historical periods, and these engagements are meant to be played in an area of 3 by 3 feet and usually in an hour or so. So definitely low-key, manageable, playable war game rules, and rules also that are definitely on the light side. We'll talk about that later. These rules being so light, being probably the strongest thing and the weakest thing in this book at the same time. So this is for those that do not have much time and space to play, and this seems to be the main target of the book according to the author in the introduction. The author has the perspective of somebody who has painted tons of miniatures, but after all the trouble of putting them together and painting them and creating these beautiful elements, they never actually get to use them because they would need a lot of space and time to set up a large engagement. And so the idea is here to give these wargamers an option to actually use those miniatures. However, to me, this is a book that is particularly useful, and it could be particularly useful for aspiring wargamers, for people that have never played miniature games. Maybe for these people, I'll point out not so obvious detail that miniature games, technically speaking, are not necessarily games that use miniatures. They use toy soldiers, they use puppets, or just little sculptures. Those are games with miniatures, and some of those are also miniature games, but they don't have to be. What? Technically speaking, miniature games are games that are played in continuous space, the way you move your units, measuring the distance instead of moving through a discrete hex grid or a discrete grid of areas. Instead of moving a certain number of spaces, you move a certain number of centimeters or inches. So technically, that simply means they happen in continuous space with a lot of tactical options and nuances that come from this aspect. And that is one of the things that fascinates me the most about miniature wargaming. Usually, these games are played with miniatures, hence the overlapping of the definition and sometimes the confusion that the miniatures are what makes a miniature game. Actually, it is the mechanics. So much so that you can go on Board Game Geek and you will find a pretty long list, a geek list, of miniature games without miniatures. That is, miniature games that have this mechanical identity of taking place in continuous space, not on a discrete grid. And they do not use miniatures, they do not use sculpture, they simply use counters, they use cardboard or other forms of non-sculptural ways of representing military units. I don't even remember why I started this digression. Yes, it was for those of you that maybe have never played a miniature game, so don't worry, you do not necessarily need to buy all of those miniatures and paint them and do all that hard work. If you want to play a war game with the tactical specificities of moving your units in continuous space, then you can do it without necessarily investing a lot of time and money in miniatures. How can you do so? Well, with paper miniatures, there are a lot of those out there. In particular, I would recommend a website called Junior General. It has tons of paper miniatures that you can assemble and then they just stand up as little paper soldiers, and other paper miniatures that are top downs. They represent the unit from top, and those are usually much easier to assemble. You simply print them, glue them on a cardboard, cut them, and then you use them as counters, and that's how I usually produce the miniatures that I use, the paper miniatures that I use for military war games. There are also other sources online of paper miniatures. Just Google paper miniatures and you will find a couple of websites that will give you the option of purchasing paper miniatures, but the great thing about the Junior General is that it is for free. So you can download a ton of stuff and print your own miniatures or counters that can be used for miniature games for free. I think it's a great tool for gamers, educators is great. If you can show a battle to the students instead of just telling them about it. So that is to say, you've never played a miniature game and maybe you are considering this. First, you do not need the miniatures, and certainly you don't need to spend a lot of time and money. You just need this book to get started. Go on Paper General, print out some counters, and you're good to go. There are also other ways of producing miniatures from other games that you may already own. For example, the battles in this game, there are rules for Napoleonic battles, and they simply use the blocks from Commands and Colors Napoleonics. There are rules for ancient battles, and I used the blocks from Commands and Colors Ancients. They work very well. For World War II, you could use the toy soldiers that you find in Tide of Iron. Just, there are many ways of finding these soldiers. Worst come to worst, if you really want the miniatures, if you go to, I don't know, CVS, even there they have those cheap, kind of ugly looking soldiers, yes, but you have those. And actually, if you want to invest a little bit more than just $5, so you go online and you will find the plastic miniatures for affordable prices. So, you want to get started with miniature gaming? These are the things you need. This book, I think it's a really good point to start, and some ways of producing your own miniatures. Now, about this book specifically, as I said, it is a very simple book, but with a lot of stuff in it. In particular, there are systems to simulate different styles of warfare from ancient times to World War II. And each of these periods are covered in 2 chapters. There's a chapter that gives you a very brief, very general historical overview of the style. For here we have Pike and Shot Wargaming, of the style of warfare, culturally, technically, logistically. What were the things that characterized a specific period? For example, we have 4 pages of information about that here in this section about Pike and Shot warfare. Then, right after that, you have a chapter with rules based on the chapter you just read. Basically, this chapter gives you the rationale of why certain rules have been added to the rules section. And the rules section is super short. It usually is 2 or 3 pages. For Pike and Shot, this is 1 page with not much text, as you can see. And this is the rest. These are the rules. Very short chapters. As you can imagine, a lot is left out. This should come as no surprise when you see that the rules are so short. On the other hand, the different periods have been given some flavor. The author did do some work to try to figure out, within those very essential mechanics that he wanted to use, which were the rules and what was the amount of chrome that could give a little bit of a period feel to each style of gaming, to each style of warfare, to each set of rules. So the rules for the ancients are different from Pike and Shot, and they're different from World War I, World War II, and so on and so forth. However, all of these styles of scenario do have some ideas in common. So I want to give you a general overview of what I would call the system, the underlying set of similarities that you find connecting the scenarios, and starting from which then the author modified things. Basically, I'm going to give you an overview of the skeleton that then has been changed and fleshed out in slightly different ways depending on the period and style of warfare to which that skeleton has been applied. But the general idea, in all of these scenarios, there are certain things that you will find. You will find the idea that I go, you go. That is, a turn is divided into players' turns. So one player goes, moves, attacks, shoots, etc., etc. Then the other player does the same. Then you start again. It's not there isn't a tight reaction interaction system. Players don't go simultaneously. Players continuously react to what the opponent has done. Even in scenarios where you have hand-to-hand combat, where you have melee, in each player's turn, only the active player inflicts damage on the opponent, which may be counterintuitive for many gamers, but certainly it helps to keep things simple. So, two players' turn, but usually what happens in a player's turn, first the units move, and different types of units have different ratings. So usually infantry is around up to 6 inches per turn. Cavalry or vehicles, depending on the time of the battle, of course, have longer distances that they can cover. But first units move, and usually units can pivot on their center at the beginning and or at the end of their movement. Then they move in a straight line. Again, they may pivot, and that's their movement. In most of these scenarios, in most of these sets of rules about specific styles of warfare, you move in a straight line. In scenarios about recent times, for example, World War II, then you can break down your movement in smaller segments as you go, but not in all scenarios. So you move, usually in a straight line. You may pivot. Then usually units that have a shooting capability can shoot, so you simply resolve range combat. And then you may or may not have hand combat. After the units with range capability have performed a range attack, units that are in contact with the opponent may be able to perform hand-to-hand combat, but depends on the scenario. For example, the rules for the American Civil War scenarios do not have hand-to-hand combat. It's all shooting, which also incidentally makes that possibly the simplest and most economic set of rules within this book. So if you really want to start simple, start with the rules about the American Civil War. Then you only have fire. The basic general idea about firing is that units that fire roll a d6. There may be penalties depending on the firing unit. If it's skirmishers in ancient times, they have a penalty. If it's archers in ancient times, they do not have a penalty. And the penalty may be +1, -1, +2, -2. But you roll the die, you apply that modifier, and the modified result is the number of hits that you inflict on the opponent. That's simple. Usually there is no table to hit. I roll a 6, I have a +2, I inflicted 8 hits, 8 points of damage on the opponent. So you will need numerical counters or other types of counter to keep track of the number of hits that you inflict on the opponent. What I did here in my plays was to use colored cubes. Yellow cubes meant a single hit, red cubes meant 5 hits, and that allowed me to keep track of the running number of hits. And usually it takes 15 hits to eliminate an opponent, so they may be inflicted in a single powerful attack over multiple attacks. This is why you need something to keep track of the number of hits. But that's the general idea. You're shooting, you simply roll to inflict damage. Of course, if you have line of sight to your target and the target is within range, you calculate the damage and you inflict it on the opponent. Depending on the scenario, the damage may be reduced by armor of the target, may be reduced by cover, things like that. Then in the scenarios where you do have hand-to-hand combat, the units that are in contact with the opponent and belong to the active player get to attack. And it's very similar to the way you resolve range combat. Simply you roll a die, you apply modifiers based on the type of unit that is attacking, sometimes also based on the type of unit that is defending. Modified result is the number of hits that you inflict on the opponent, and that, depending on the scenario, may be reduced by terrain, by armor, by cover, or may be increased by positioning, for example, in certain sets of rules. If you're attacking through a flank or a rear, then you double the number of hits, but if the opponent has an armor bonus, then you half the number of hits. But this is the general idea. All combat is resolved by rolling d6s, adding modifiers, inflicting the number of hit points on the opponent, and that may be further modified by conditions of the target. This is the general idea, super simple. After reading this, I was like, oh gee, maybe I could have just come up with this by myself. This is really the most basic idea that you can have for move, shoot, hit in melee, remove units. And of course, it seemed easy to me after I read it here. Before that, before reading it in this book, I hadn't figured it out. So credit where credit is due. It may sound simple, but it's a simple idea that I did not have. So I learned something here. I learned that yes, indeed, you can have a super simple war game based on this general and very economic core of rules. Then you have modifications depending on the style, depending on the period that you are playing. For example, in the ancient scenarios, as I said, you have firing units, yes, but then you have armor. I was talking about armor, I was referring to the ancients, and because that is where infantry has a bonus based on armor against ranged and melee, and you also have flanking, which is important. In the rules for the Napoleonic battles, for example, you can have cavalry charges. So there definitely are hints of flavor. There are minor things, definitely minor things, that have been added or modified in each of the scenarios, each of the styles of wargaming that you have here, to give you a bit of historical flavor. Up to now, I talked about scenarios whenever I was referring to, say, the ACW, Ancients, or Pike and Shot. This is not accurate. I was more accurate the times in which I talked about these things as sets of rules, because each is an independent, complete set of rules. They also have scenarios, but they're in the second section of the book, and you have 30 scenarios simply representing different type of engagement, which can be the last stand, can be disordered defense, all sorts of things, counterattack, etc., etc. Which means that you can choose an historical period, World War I, American Civil War, Rifle and Saber, etc., etc. And then you can combine that with any of the scenarios. You can also come up with your own scenarios. These scenarios here are pretty generic. They represent generic military situations: the bottleneck, the flank attack, the pitched battle, etc., etc. Then, of course, you can add detail to reproduce specific battles. But here you do have a nice toolbox, because you have sets for various periods, you have 30 general situations. Again, in a sense, they're so simple and basic that you think, probably could have come up with this by myself, but you have somebody who came up with that first, maybe. And in any case, even if you already design your own scenarios and things like that, it's always nice to have virtual conversation with somebody else, and you always get the insights, you always get ideas. Even if you don't like something in here because you have your own preconceived ideas, then you're even stronger in your ideas, because now I better understand why I don't like that I just read here, so I better understand why I like what I like. So it's a toolbox. It's a toolbox, but it's one with a lot of potential in here, because you do have historical rules for a lot of periods, you do have a lot of scenarios, and you have the possibility of customizing it, which is really important, really key here. As I said, the simplicity is the strongest element in this set of rules. The simplicity that in 10 minutes you can learn a war game. This is one of the advantages, together with the fact that the battles, in fact, do not require many units, do not require much time or space. On the other hand, these battles still feel generic. As soon as you play it, if you have any experience with wargaming, you start feeling the need to tweak something, to add something, to change something. In the point, however, is that if you're in the right mindset, that doesn't have to be a bad thing, because the book, in a certain sense, encourages you to do so precisely because there are standard rules that work. There's nothing particularly wrong in moving, shooting, and inflicting damage and modifying that based on circumstances. Most what I've done is I was playing and I started adding rules in my mind was simply to add modifiers, to add more situations that can modify the amount of damage that a unit can take, or the bonus or penalty to hit. More things based on terrain, things of this kind. Range, there is usually within the same range, there is no penalty. In some sets of rules, I added a penalty for firing at maximum range, like in the top bracket, in the top third of the range, or bonus for firing a very short range, and no modifier for firing in the central band of the range. In the scenarios about the ancients, in the ancient scenarios, the rules say that units are locked in combat. Once they make contact, they keep hitting each other until they destroy each other. I ruled that the cavalry can always disengage from contact with infantry, and I ruled that skirmishers can always disengage from contact with heavier infantry. It worked. I had fun playing that way, and it really was not hard. So you can come up with your own twists, as long as you're not expecting, I don't know how that would happen, but you're not expecting to pick up this book and to have a simple set of rules that is detailed with a lot of chrome, a lot of nuances. That expectation will probably be pretty unrealistic. As long as you know what you're getting, which is a very simple set of sets of rules that maybe modern rules you can see as suggestions, as recommendations, as ideas, as a brainstorming tool to come up with your own ideas. In that sense, I found this book to be pretty valuable. If you're not expecting something that this book cannot give you, if you're approaching it as something that will stimulate your creativity and will help you come up with your own ideas and designing more nuanced battles with more chrome, I think this is a valuable purchase, definitely a valuable book to read. For the aspiring wargamer, also this is great. Very often aspiring wargamers may not have a lot of experience in wargames, if they have any at all, but they do have some experience with war and with history of warfare. In this case, you have such a simple basic core of rules, and then you start adding rules and modifications based on your understanding, your interpretation of historical fiction or of historical factors, or based on whatever you want to do. You want to add alien attacks in World War I, by all means, feel free to do so. All you have to do is to simply find out the range and add a couple of modifiers, a couple of rules, and you can do that. So the fact that these rules are so basic and so simple to me has value also in the fact that these are not only these rules accessible to a new gamer, they're definitely not threatening, and even a new wargamer will probably feel encouraged in a non-threatening way, in an inviting way to start thinking about game design creatively. Another value that I find in this book is in its pedagogical potential. Meaning, those short chapters, yes, they're very generic. Yes, when I read those chapters, I don't agree with everything that I read, but that's normal. I rarely agree with everything that I read anywhere. But they can be good starting points, for example, for a class discussion. If you have your students read these short chapters, it can be a very broad, broad picture of the style of warfare of a certain period, but it is a starting point. Then you can add things, then you can correct things, then you can ask the students what they think about it, about this and that. You can contrast these rules with maybe essays about the war style of a certain period, and the students can find, I think that can find reasons to be engaged. I think that these short chapters, as short and generic as they are not the Bible of wargaming. They're not the Bible of warfare history, but they can be an interesting point of debate. It can be an interesting topic for conversation, especially in the classroom. Another thing that I like is that the rules are so simple. Yes, the students can easily learn the rules and they can play the game even if they never played a war game before, even if they're not gamers. Also, the time and space range here will allow you, if you're teaching a class, to set up a game, bring your paper miniatures, or set it up quickly, play it, and put it away within the time frame of a single class meeting. So that is definitely good, so you don't have to break up an activity in multiple sessions, and then the next time you reconvene the class you can talk about what happened. But what I also like very much, I think this is probably something that I will do, is that you could choose a chapter or ask the students to choose a chapter which corresponds to a style of warfare, and so to read the generic introduction and the generic rules for that period, and then to go and look for a specific battle in that period of time that interests them, and starting from their understanding of that battle, add all of the details that will allow you to use the system to play that battle. Which would be something like I assign the Ancients chapter to a group of students. That is going to be their project. Then they read those rules and they look into a battle that seems interesting to them. Maybe Pharsalus, maybe Gargamel, whatever battles of ancient times that they find interesting. And then they create a map, and then they go on Paper Junior, on Junior General, they print the miniatures, and they add the rules based on other readings that they will research about the battle that is selected. They read a book about the battle, and they think, well, based on that battle, it seems that the cavalry was particularly badass there. Why don't we give them a bonus? Well, it seems that the command on that side was particularly incompetent. Why don't we give them a penalty to do something like that? I like the open-ended nature of these rules, which I think will make them disappointing, annoying, and underwhelming to many wargamers, to the ones that are used to the big, heavy, deep stuff. And probably they don't need this book. This is not a book that will be of value to everyone. But for aspiring wargamers, for educators, and for wargamers that are indeed pressed for time and space, and or that occasionally want to take a break from the heavy stuff and want to play something light and simple, I think this is a book that can be useful, can be definitely valuable. I'm personally happy that I read this book because I got to play some fun battles, and actually this is the bottom line that probably didn't stress enough. I haven't even mentioned it. I got to play some really fun battles starting from this. Not historical battles, I simply played the scenarios. I didn't go into looking for ways of simulating specific battles. But definitely for somebody like me who teaches in college, and I teach classes about history, about warfare, about war as a cultural phenomenon, about a lot of things concerning battles, I think this is a great tool. This is going to be a very good tool in my classes because it will be a useful guide for my students to prepare them towards what could be a final project, or in any case, interactive and engaging ways of experiencing history or firsthand or hands-on. So this was my review for 1 Hour Wargames by Neil Thomas. It's a nice book. Nothing special for the experienced wargamer, but I think it's a book that contains a lot of interesting ideas for almost everybody else.